This virtual festival has been organized by Youth Celebrate Diversity, and the festival is proudly sponsored by Boeing.
Hello, my name is Graham Tweegatis, and I am one of the current co-chairs of the Colorado Summit in Inclusivity in Teen Athletics and Activities. Today, we're going to be talking with a few panel guests, including Joaquin, a current student at Kent Denver, who just joined us right now, right on schedule. Mr. Patrick DeCamillis, the current athletic director at Silver Creek High School, and Ms. Anucha Browne, the Chief Strategy and Engagement Officer, joined as well just right now at UNICEF USA, as well as the Vice President of the NCAA Women's Basketball Championship in 2012. Hello. Awesome. So we're going to get started right now, just to get jumping in. So first, do you both want to explain your past experiences in sport as well as the work you're currently doing? Ms. Browne, if you want to start, you're currently muted.
Sure, I can begin. First, my name is Anucha Browne, and I currently serve as Chief Engagement, Advocacy, and Global Programs Officer at UNICEF USA. Prior to this, do you want to introduce the last speaker before we get started? No? You're on mute.
The joys of this technical environment. That, I believe, is Mr. Patrick DeCamillis, the current athletic director at, I think we just lost him. So if you want to continue.
So I'm just going to keep going. Sure, when he joins, you just let me know. So as I said, I currently am with UNICEF USA, and my role in this current environment is to work with our volunteer organizing structure around the country. We have thousands and thousands of volunteers that volunteer on behalf of UNICEF to educate the American public on the needs and child rights. And really, it's bringing young people together to uplift their voice so that they can have a voice around things that impact children. Prior to this work, I spent 5 years at the NCAA. I was the Vice President of Women's Basketball Championships. And so I was responsible for the Final Four at the Division I, II, and III level. And so worked on a number of Final Fours. Really just, when people asked me what my job was, it was to make dreams come true. But, earlier in my career, I spent a lot of time on campus at University of Buffalo. I was a senior associate athletic director and very involved in a lot of recruiting. And prior to that, I was at the New York Knicks, so I worked in professional sports. And it's interesting because I started out in sport. I was a student athlete, played basketball at Northwestern University, was really afforded an amazing opportunity to play on the U.S. national team and got to travel the globe playing basketball.
Great. And I can go next. I am a senior at Kent Denver, and I really wanted to join this conversation and offer my point of view as well. So I'm really involved in my school, I believe. I'm president of the Entrepreneurship Club. I'm also a member of the Student Leadership Council. But two things that I think would be very valuable in this conversation are my membership as the captain of the speech and debate team, and additionally as a co-captain of the varsity football team. And I think I may also be able to bring a helpful perspective into this conversation as well.
Again, thank you both so much for taking part in this conversation and offering both of your guys' experience in conversations surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion in sports and activities. So first, kind of jumping in, Ms. Browne, I know that you've had a lot of experience in working with youth and specifically helping youth become leaders in their respective fields across a variety of different disciplines, activities. And how do you feel that youth can be a leading force in bringing change to athletic and activities-based communities?
Well, I think it has to start with youth input. One of the most important things that I think is often forgotten is the importance of making sure that youth have an authentic seat at the table when decisions are being made on their behalf. I think in this country, we typically come from a philosophy of children should be seen and not heard. And at UNICEF, we believe, and this is what our work is rooted in all over the world, is that we have to uplift the voices of youth, not as a charitable gesture, but because we believe that children have rights. And one of the most important rights is their right to express themselves. And so if there are issues relative to what their involvement in sport programs that are offered to them, their interaction with coaches, interaction with sport administrators, they should have a seat at the table. I often like to say that youth are 25% of our population, but they're 100% of our future. And because of that, they deserve a seat at the table.
And Mr. Barker, do you want to kind of jump in on that? Because I know you mentioned that you're the current captain of the speech and debate team at your school.
I think that's a really interesting fact that you just brought up there. The fact that 25% of our population are children, are youth. And I think that in many ways, children are the future and youth are the future. And as a member of my school speech and debate team, that's something that I think about really every weekend. And one of the interesting kind of silver linings, if you will, about this entire thing is my ability to meet people really from around the country. Last weekend, I participated in a speech and debate tournament at Yale University, and the entire speech and debate tournament was conducted over Zoom. And I got to meet and to interact with students from really all around the country. So I think that one of the things that's really great about COVID-19, despite all the downfalls and many of the repercussions, one of the things that I've really enjoyed is the ability to connect with and to meet with other people.
And were you able to make any friends at that event or really make any connections there?
I sure was. I met students really from all around the country. I met a junior from Arizona, a senior from Massachusetts, people that I maybe never even would have had the chance to meet if I had not gone to that event. So I think it's really nice because the old speech and debate tournaments, you would have to fly all the way over to the East Coast or to the West Coast, and it would cost a lot of money to book a hotel room. But now it's a lot more equitable and inclusive. So I think that's one of the nice things, that I'm able to meet with other youth activists through speech and debate.
And I know that, as you mentioned, that this was held entirely in a virtual environment, of course, due to COVID-19 and safety concerns. How do you both feel about, do you think that that's almost a silver lining of the current pandemic and our current situation where we have to stay quarantined and make sure that we're staying safe? Do you think that there are some advantages in that sense, that we can make some more connections virtually and meet people that we might not have been able to meet in a normal environment?
Well, I'll start. I do think that there are silver linings in the fact that we're in a virtual environment and we're forced into a virtual environment. But one of the most important factors and results of COVID-19 is this pulling the curtain back on a number of disparities. We know that there are so many communities that don't have access to broadband, don't have access to the internet, don't have iPads, don't have computers, and they've gone virtually silent, and so their voices aren't heard, and they're not able to interact. We know that because of COVID-19, we know that there are healthcare disparities that have arisen, and what I will say is I think, because of the things that have been unleashed as a result of COVID, we're seeing this emergence of youth voice more so than we've ever seen it. And I think that's the silver lining. What we saw back in October and last September in 2019 was this huge wave of youth activism around climate in the United States and around the world. And you also began to see young people marching and getting themselves involved in issues of violence against children. And now you've seen in this past spring, this issue of racial justice in this country, and young people are coming together and saying, this is enough. And what we're now seeing is this convergence, even virtually, we're seeing this convergence of all of these different youth voices and youth movements. Young people are saying there's no climate justice without racial justice. There's no racial justice without addressing issues of disparities. And so I think COVID has uncovered what has been there for a long time, and it's going to force us. And I commend young people because they are lifting their voices around this, and they're trying to bring other young people who might be in underserved communities to the table to have these very important discussions on things that are going to affect our future.
I think that's a really good point. And to go off of that, I think one of the interesting things is kind of comparing certain activities like Model UN or mock trial or speech and debate, and looking at those activities and then looking at athletics. And I think like Miss Browne pointed out, there's a really big disparity between different schools. And I know with athletics, that's a really telling example. I know that if we look at athletics, there are certain schools and certain programs, perhaps some of those schools are more rural, that have a lot of challenges. And some of these challenges have to do with equipment, simply not having enough equipment for a certain team. Other of these challenges have to do with transportation. Often in rural communities, it's difficult to get from one point to another, and it takes a very long time. And some of those schools don't have the equipment. So I think it's a really important thing to understand that what we're going through right now, inclusivity is something that's very important. And I think, well, on the one hand, certain things are able to level the playing field and make them more equal. There are also a number of underlying inequalities that are very jarring and important to think about. So I think in understanding those, it's a very important step. And I think that it's definitely right to not acknowledge these things if we need to advance.
And we're going to be coming back to some of those systematic inequalities that exist within athletics and activities a little bit later. But kind of jumping off what you were both saying, do you feel that these tools have become available due to COVID-19, or do you feel that they're just being accessed in a slightly unique way, tools like Zoom or even apps like TikTok? Do you feel that those are just being accessed a little bit more, or just being used in a different light now due to the current pandemic, or just changes in our system as a whole?
Do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. I think really this stuff would not have been possible even 10 years ago. And I think with a lot of the technologies that we've been seeing, that we're able to connect with a lot more people. And one example is my ability to even meet Graham and to meet everyone on the student board that was introduced before. And this would not have been possible even 10 years ago. But I think one of the great things about certain technologies like Zoom is that they allow people from really all across Colorado to meet. I know that we had people from northeastern Colorado in our student board, people from far southern Colorado. And I think in many ways, we get caught up in this insular idea of what Colorado is, just the Denver metro area. And I think a great thing about Zoom is that it kind of helps us expand our horizons. So I think in that sense, technology has been very useful at catalyzing and creating many of these conversations.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I would also agree. I think this has really uncovered another opportunity to really have us all kind of assess, particularly in the work that I do. I travel all over the world, and I go to many meetings, and this has forced us to really do an assessment of our carbon footprint. And is all of this travel absolutely necessary? We have proven now in the last 6 months that we can get so much done over these Zoom meetings. It's not necessarily ideal because there is so much to be said about being in the same room with individuals. But in this environment, it's forced us to kind of say, okay, did I really need to go to that meeting in London? Right? I think in the context of sport, it's different because what it's done is it's taken sport away from a lot of individuals. And in many communities, sport is the one place where young people could get out of the home and be with like-minded individuals and work out. And some of that, so, again, it's uncovered some disparities. Some of the programs in the inner cities don't have the PPE, don't have the adult supervision that's necessary to engage in sport. And so some of these have been put on it's forced a lot of sports to go dark. And I do think that that's had a profound impact on people's level of satisfaction and mental health. So there's a lot to be said. I think there's a lot to be done. I do think that technology has helped. I think with the boredom that's existed, I think TikTok has become has gone off the charts. Everybody loves it. And that's a good thing because it gives opportunities for people to communicate and share how they're feeling. So I think there's been positive, but it's uncovered some of the disparities that exist.
Yeah, and just based on kind of looking at the numbers, the NCAA has, of course, canceled fall sports and moved those championships to spring of 2021. And over 37 states have canceled or modified their seasons at the high school level due to COVID-19. And kind of just based on that, how do you feel that this will affect sports and the communities built around them moving forward?
Well, okay, go ahead. Nope, I'm giving it to you. I
Great.
like to hear young people speak.
I think one thing that's really interesting is that this idea of COVID-19 and whether or not to play sports has actually become something that's very controversial and something that's also very polemic. I think a very interesting area to look at is college sports and college football in particular. Some regions of the country are continuing to play football and other regions are not. In much the same way, we see that in the United States, or rather within the state of Colorado, there are some schools that are allowing kids to play and other schools that are not. And even within the same schools, there are certain sports where some people are able to play. One of these sports, of course, is cross country. But there are some sports, such as wrestling, that people don't necessarily think are the best sports to play. So I think it's very interesting, at least when I'm answering your question, to kind of see in many ways a division of what is going on here, and seeing that some people are continuing to play sports and others are not.
Yeah, I'm gonna come to this from a more of a just a health perspective. I really believe that the only way to get on the other side of COVID-19 is for us to do what the medical community is recommending. And that is to eliminate anything that potentially can be a spreading event. And I know that we've legislated this state by state, and we're managing it state by state, county by county, city by city. But we now know that this is not working. And unless we organize as one country, as many other countries have done, and determine what is in the best interest, how do we get past this? We could be in this holding pattern for the next 2 years at this rate, which is having a profound effect on individuals' ability to matriculate, to go to college and play sport. We are basically in a holding pattern. And until we get ahead of this, I would say that while I think it's so important for young people to have a space to play, in this environment, we need to really focus on what the medical professionals are telling us to do to mitigate the spread of this disease so that we can get on the other side of this, so that you all, young people, can actually get on the field of play and do what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and how should teams act? Can we take advantage of some of those tools? Like, for example, we mentioned Zoom and we talked about TikTok, and there's quite a few virtual races, for example, for cross country. How can we take advantage of those tools so that way athletes can still be able to feel like they are part of a team and are able to participate in the sport, even if it's a little bit different due to COVID-19?
Well, I would say that if you have access to technology, and many don't, but if you have access to technology, there are ways to do group workouts. We have figured this out. If we were on complete lockdown, we would have to figure it out, right? And so we know what we have to do, right? Sometimes, the lesson that I learned as a student athlete is there's always somebody practicing. And if you play a sport where you need someone else to go out and pass to you, play basketball, that's actually an excuse. You can find a court and go play basketball. You can find a wall and play wall ball with lacrosse ball. There are things you can do that don't require you to be in a group. And so it really comes down to how important is that sport to you. And these are times where you really get to understand who you are as an individual, right? Sometimes they can be lonely times, but in those times of loneliness, you actually figure out what drives you and what motivates you. And so these are very important times. And I wouldn't shy away from this idea of what do I do if I don't have somebody pushing me? And that's where you get to the essence of who you are as an athlete.
And totally going off of that, that's something that we practice at my school. I think team workouts are really one of the best ways to kind of deal with this. But an interesting thing that I think that we've seen is this phenomenon. And what happens is that a lot of people attempt to get around a lot of the rules. One example, of course, is club sports. A lot of people are looking into club sports as an alternative to schools that don't provide in-person sports. And another alternative or way to kind of get around this that we've seen is people even moving to different states. I think one example that was particularly interesting to me is that a star high school quarterback in the state of Colorado actually decided to move to Iowa to play. So I think that's interesting. But I think that there are definitely ways that we can take advantage of technology to continue not only to connect with other people, but also to practice and also to continue to be part of of sports and to continue to play.
And I'm kind of jumping in off of that. We know that, of course, there's quite a bit of worry about the community surrounding these sports. The athletes who have become friendly over time due to their connections, whether it's the position they play in a sport like football or the fact that they're just racing alongside another athlete in a sport like cross country. And some of this, of course, has been kind of quite affected by the fact that we, of course, have to stay in a virtual environment and that some students are moving out of state in order to make sure that they can still play their sport, whether that be to make sure that they can try to play that sport at the college level or not. How do you feel that we can try to keep that community together? Because I know that's a very big worry for some people right now, trying to maintain that wider sporting community outside of just the school level or the between two friends level.
Well, here's what I would say. I've had the opportunity to move all over the world and to interact with the haves and the have-nots. And we are really privileged here. And it's not something we should shy away from because we're really fortunate. But I go back to this point of the need to get on the other side of what is happening in this country. We have states that are exploding in COVID cases. And so we have to figure out ways that we can maintain contact with each other. I know, as an example, I go running, and in my earphone, I have my sister and I'm talking to her and we're motivating each other. She's running, I'm running. There are ways for us to get around this. I think the most important thing that we have to address as Americans is how we get on the other side of this so that our young people can get back into school as soon as possible, can get back into their sport as soon as possible. And I encourage people to not lose sight of what's happening across the United States. I don't want to be this has been very troubling, but it's been very confining, and it's forced us to all do some thinking about, what's happening in the United States. If we could just simply come together around how we get on the other side of COVID-19 and doing what we need to do to protect our elderly, to protect those who have pre-existing health conditions, and we think about that, we'll be all right. I think we can still continue to practice our sport and come out on the other side of this, but we've got to figure out how we all do this together.
I agree. I think political solutions are very important. And I think that not just on a state level, but I think on a national level, we need the type of leadership, a type of leadership that's able to help us end this COVID-19 virus once and for all. But I think in some ways it's a psychological thing as well. I know that we crave interaction, we crave relationships, and in some ways, something like COVID-19 stops us from doing what we're psychologically used to, seeking out friendships, seeking out relationships, seeking out communication and connection. But I think that Ms. Browne's totally right. I think what we need to do at present is to find a political solution, a solution that gets rid of COVID-19, that helps people with PPE, and that helps us end the virus so that we can go back to the way that things were once were. But at present, and again, for those that do have access to Wi-Fi and broadband internet, I think connection with people is still important, and using different mediums such as Zoom and FaceTime can also be very important.
And we talked a little bit earlier about youth kind of being at the forefront of a lot of these movements. And how do both of you feel that youth can be at the forefront of this movement of trying to help stop COVID in at least the manners that we can?
Well, this is in essence what I do. This is my work. It's really about uplifting young people. We've seen young people take to the streets. I'm not encouraging young people to take to the streets in the COVID environment, but I am encouraging young people to have voice around these issues. Your voice is as important, if not more important, than those of adults. I've had an opportunity to travel to other places and see children in rights respecting environments and how they're taught from the very early age to speak up for themselves. and to address issues of conflict and to address issues that are very polarizing in a very, when I think about Malala was actually raised in a UNICEF-enabled child rights environment where she learned from an early age how to speak on behalf of what her issues were and present those. And so I think young people must have their voices heard and demand a seat at the table, and seek out opportunities to be involved in the movement of their interest. If it's climate, if it's racial justice, if it's ending violence against children, if it's, if it's focused on child protection or migration or whatever that particular issue is, young people can find an avenue to be involved in these movements. I'll stop there, but the last thing I'll say is I think the turning point that we're going to see in this is this convergence of all of these movements. Young people are saying enough. They're saying we need to end racial injustice. We need to end this ignorance around climate because it's affecting our future. And young people are saying, we're not going to have this anymore. And we need to stay united in that. That's the work that I do. I encourage young people to get involved and volunteer and get involved in these organizations, even in a virtual environment, so that they can have their voices heard around these issues. We don't have to agree. Young people don't have to agree. They might come from different schools of thought. But it is that disagreement and having those uncomfortable conversations as young people that allow us to move forward.
And definitely going off of that, I think activism is another point. But with COVID-19, I think at least what I've seen and what I've heard about is a feeling of nonchalance from young people, and that's something that I think is absolutely not okay. I think as young people, it's also incumbent upon us to understand that while this may not necessarily impact us in the worst ways, we need to look at older generations, and we need to look at our grandparents and our parents, and we need to take a stand. Because as young people, not wearing masks, not socially distancing is something that could have very pernicious implications, not just on us, but our entire communities and our loved ones. So I think in these COVID-19 times, it is absolutely crucial that we follow social distancing, that we wear masks, that we ensure proper PPE, and do everything that we can to finish COVID-19 so that we can go back to our athletics and our activities, and so we can continue our activism as it was before.
And kind of jumping off of that, there's also quite a bit of I kind of almost describe it as cognitive dissonance currently happening, especially in the state of Colorado. Just kind of for some prior knowledge, our state has gone over and has only allowed certain sports to proceed in very specific environments where they're trying to keep people as safe as they possibly can, while keeping certain sports at a later date where they feel that they might be able to have them in a little bit more safer of an environment. And there's a little bit of a little bit confusion, at least among, I think, Colorado students in my experience, about how they kind of take this response to COVID. Should they argue for sports now? Should they just agree that they might have sports later? How do you feel that students should take this, of course, because we all want our sports to be able to happen at the time that they would normally happen, but still trying to keep ourselves safe as well as our families and those who are in a situation where they might be incredibly affected by COVID. How do we keep those groups safe while making sure that we're not going over and being selfish in arguing for our sports?
Well, it's a really tough question, right? Because if you're in an environment where your friends are going to play a sport, you're hard pressed to stay home. There's a lot of group pressure here. So, if you're on a team and your coach has decided to practice, it's kind of, you have to go practice. I do think that young people should talk to their parents and make decisions that they think are responsible. There are certain sports, obviously, that are more contact focused than others. Tennis is one they're saying that, is playable. Wrestling, maybe not. But I'm hard pressed to believe why wrestling is not what football is. And so, I think we have found a way for certain sports to be played and ways for others not to be played. And sometimes I worry that it's around the popularity of the sport, which is very troubling. But I do think young people should have voice in this. I think that, these decisions lay at the parental level, but while they lay at the parental level, I think young people should be thinking about how do we mitigate the spread of COVID? How do we act responsibly until we get on the other side of this? What part do I need to play as a student athlete currently to make sure that I'm doing what is responsible and what will mitigate the spread of COVID-19?
And going off of that point, one interesting thing that I think is cool about this conversation is the idea of flexibility. I know personally many people who play soccer and field hockey, and those sports were canceled this season. And one of the interesting things is that these field hockey players and these soccer players actually decided to join the cross-country team. And so I think that's a really good thing, and it's also very important to be flexible. But as the idea of playing in the fall season, I'm someone who believes in the experts, and I really trust Commissioner Blanford Green and what she says. And I'm someone who respects COVID-19, respects PPE, and I understand that CHASA as a committee and as a board decided to push sports back into the spring. And as a student, I'm totally behind that decision, and I respect that decision and will wait until the spring.
One of the other things, like everybody should come back with like a 6-pack and a grill in the springtime, right? Everybody should come back. They should be able to do 100 push-ups. There's no excuse if your sport has been pushed to the spring that you don't come back to the spring in like ridiculous shape. Just like that's my challenge out there to every student athlete that's listening.
And I think that another kind of challenge that student athletes are facing, and there's been quite a bit of talking about, especially in fall sports, has been recruiting. And of course, there's quite a bit to talk about with recruiting in general. You could spend days talking about our recruiting system in the United States. But what do you both feel, what should college and high school athletes be doing during the pandemic, in your opinion, and especially high school athletes who are looking to be recruited but are not able to due to their sports being canceled in their state or having been postponed until a later date?
Let me go first. So again, this is the time when you can really go from good to great. This is the time where you do those individual workouts that are about you, your skills, and your skills only. And there's no excuse. It really isn't an excuse. The one thing I will tell you about recruiting, because I've been on both sides of it, I was recruited as a student athlete to many schools to play basketball. And then I became a sport administrator. And I was involved in the recruiting process of high school student athletes. I would tell you that losing a season, you shouldn't be concerned about, because the cream rises to the top. If you have the skills and you have the talent and you have the motivation to continue to practice in this COVID environment, you're going to come out on top. The cream rises to the top. I will also say is many of these coaches in college, they don't need to have the superior athlete. They want the athlete that's got the most upside. They don't want the guy that is, or the girl who is at the top of their sport, because then there's no upside. There's nothing to teach them. They want young people that come into school, they're in ridiculous shape, they're committed to their sport, and they get it. Their job as college coaches is, I'm going to coach you to play in my system. So I would say to everyone in this COVID environment, go to your individual practices. Assume that what if we had no more sport for the next year? Get a game plan in place and then stick with it. That's what the coach is going to be able to see, who's been practicing and who hasn't. So the COVID environment offers you an opportunity to really see how serious you are with your sport.
And I think it's also about resourcefulness. And, although you may not be able to play a sport, it's about using the resources that you have, a lot of time that you have because you don't have practice after school every day, and using that time in the best way possible. Maybe that's doing 100 push-ups a day or running 5 miles every day. And by the end of COVID-19, I assume that may be something that really, really helps. But I also look at this recruiting thing from another way. I also look at it as recruiting freshmen. And that's something that's been very difficult this year, not only with football, but also with speech and debate. And especially in this online environment, in this world of Zoom, it's very difficult to have face-to-face conversations with freshmen and to recruit people to your team. And so I think that especially on a high school level, it's important for seniors and juniors and coaches to find a way to connect with underclassmen so that the team is able to flourish in the years to come.
And kind of speaking about both the connections between the high school and college level, as well as beyond into pro and amateur sports in the master's level as well, there's quite a bit of conversation about how there's a lot of disconnectivity, and we kind of talked about how every single state has a little bit of a different plan when it comes to approaching COVID-19. How do you both feel that sports as a whole, whether it be basketball, football, cross country, track, how do you feel that these sports can come together and cross boundaries in order to kind of unite in making a singular statement, not just on issues surrounding COVID-19, but also on issues surrounding race and socioeconomic status and many of the other problems that are facing our kind of sporting community as a whole, as well as most Americans?
I'll let you start.
I think cohesiveness, great. I think cohesiveness is really a really important thing. And I think that we kind of see this lack of cohesion, not only between different states, but also between different teams. And I think as athletes and as people and as high school students and as young people in general, I think that we need to have a social contract, a revisitation, a reimagination of the social contract that we have. And I think that the events of the past months have really brought to light that we need to examine the social contract that we have. And I think that ideally we update the norms that we have, and we create norms where everyone is respected regardless of their background. And so I see that as a way really to bolster equity and to bolster inclusivity really with us teenagers and with us young people.
Yeah, I would add this is, as we talked about this time being really odd because we've had to go inside or spend less time with our friends. It offers us an opportunity to get to know other people that don't look like us. One of the most important things that young people need to be, whether if they live in environments where everyone looks like them, seek out opportunities to be a part of organizations that allow them to have some experience and some interaction, be it virtual, with people who come from different places and different experiences. It's so important, and to that point, in relating it to sport, that's what the sports environment offers, right? When you go to a college campus, it's like this, you see people that don't look like you, that come from different places, and that is one of the best joys of sport. Nobody really cares who you're from. They care, can you ball? Can you put the ball in the basket? Can you throw the ball? I think that's one of the beauties of sport. And in this environment, think about how the things that you can do even outside of the sport environment virtually. Get involved. Be civic oriented. We have an election coming up. Listen to the issues. Make sure that you're aware of them. Have conversations with people who aren't like-minded. It's really important to be able to have dialogue in this crazy environment where it seems like adults won't. Young people can have conversations with people who don't think like they do, and they can be healthy conversations. And then they can bring those conversations home and talk to their family members about those, because it's just important that we take the time to get to know those who don't look like us, don't think like us, don't worship like us, haven't had the same experiences of us. And this is the time to do it when we're stuck inside. And the virtual environment offers that. So I would just encourage young people to not miss the opportunity.
And we've talked a little bit about how in this virtual environment that many of us are incredibly lucky in that we were able to take advantages of applications like Zoom or access to the internet. And kind of jumping into that, according to the Aspen Institute's Project Play, about 1/3 of parents making, about 1 in 3 parents making under $50,000 a year have said that sports cost too much and that it makes it hard for their children to be able to participate in those sports. And how do you feel that COVID affects this? And more so, what do you feel we can do in order to try to break down these barriers that are stopping kids from participating in experiences that might be able to provide them with access to a college education through recruiting and college athletics, or to the opportunity just to make new friends and to get into a better understanding of another person in their respective sport or activity?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is the recruiting calendar. I think the recruiting calendar seems to be at the crux of the issue, where everyone is playing to be showcased as opposed to playing because of love of the sport. And I also think that the recruiting calendar has made the role of the high school coach less of a priority. And when I was coming up and playing, they recruited through my high school coach. They didn't recruit through a club team. And the high school coach was someone who spent, when you are a high school coach, those are the individuals that know you the best, right? They spend not only, many of them are teachers, so teachers by training, but they are in the school. They get to know you because they know you either through your administrators or know you through classes. And we've lost that in many respects. I think there are a few states where that's left. And if anything, I would love to see us go back to the day when you were recruiting through your high school coach, where everything wasn't rooted in, oh my gosh, this is a dead period, or this is a recruiting period, where kids actually went to basketball camps or summer camps to practice their sport, as opposed to, I just need to be on an AAU team or a club team and play game after game after game and practice bad habits, but actually work on skills development. So I think that, some of this, much of this is rooted in the recruiting calendar around these sports, and some sports are trying to affect change. I've seen lacrosse try to really reduce or change the calendar so that there's more of an alignment with the high school season. I'd like to see more of that. But I also encourage young people to get underneath, like, why is there so much less emphasis on the high school season and so much more emphasis on the club season? Because that's where it's expensive, right? It doesn't cost to play high school basketball, but it costs to play club basketball. And that's all about the recruiting piece. So I'll stop there.
I think that's totally right. I think we've seen in many ways a commercialization of our sports. But another thing that I think is really important is equipment. And you kind of brought up the example of lacrosse. In middle school, I used to play lacrosse, and the equipment for lacrosse is very expensive. You need a helmet, you need chest pads, you need arm equipment as well. And I think another way to kind of increase inclusivity in our sports, especially the sports like football and lacrosse, where you may especially have to pay a lot of money for the equipment, is finding certain organizations that help create equipment, and maybe even finding used equipment organizations that can donate equipment to other people. But I think that in sports where equipment may be a barrier, I think providing that equipment is something that is absolutely crucial. And I think at specific schools where transportation may be difficult, I think another way to come around a lot of these problems is using transportation and providing transportation for rural school districts. And I think that if we're able to focus on equipment on the one hand, and if we're able to focus on transportation on the other, I think that will definitely help increase inclusivity. But the recruiting system seems to be at the center or at the crux of this problem as well.
And really, I appreciate the kind of discussion about equipment, especially in sports like hockey, or hockey is a very good example, and it has quite a bit of equipment that is required for it, and that does make it a very hard barrier of entry for certain families who might not be able to afford that equipment. And I think it's also interesting on the kind of club end, and really kind of focusing on that. There seems to have become a proliferation, especially during COVID-19, of club sports becoming more important in people's eyes than high school sports, either because they're still happening or because they just feel that they provide a better experience in some shape or form. And how can we dispel that notion in both your opinions of that club sports is inherently better than a high school sporting experience?
If I'm a parent, I actually want my kid to be around somebody who's around them most of the day, who gets to know them, right? Not somebody you just drop off to. It's making a lot of money. It's not to say not to say the club coaches don't care about their athletes, because they absolutely do. But I would love to restore more respect to the high school coach, high school administrators, because they do a tremendous job. They're not only invested in you as a student, they're invested in you as an athlete, and they're invested in you as a person. And so as I said in my last comment, I think that, it's not mutually exclusive. It's not either or, but I do think that the wave or the pendulum has swung so heavily to the club side that we have lost the importance of that high school athletic experience with their high school team. There's also a lot to be said around being a member of a community and a community team, which is usually your high school team. There's a tremendous amount of joy in that. I think that I just would simply like to see us restore that.
I agree. I think we need a revitalization in many ways of the high school team as a result of the commercialization that we've seen from all of these club teams. And I think another interesting phenomenon that I've seen is people from smaller high schools, schools that perhaps don't have as much clout, for instance, going to schools that are much larger, 5A schools, and transitioning from smaller schools that may offer, for instance, 8-man football to schools with 4,000 kids. So I think that in some ways, that's a problem that also needs to be addressed with the high school team, but we need definitely to find a way to reverse this pendulum of commercialization in sports.
And just kind of jumping off that as well, how can club teams also act as a force of good in trying to help bring back high school sports in some ways, and helping to make sure that high school coaches are receiving their due, and that kids are actually participating in high school sports and not just taking part wholly in the club side of things, where they feel that they are getting a better experience in some shape?
I think some states have done this really well. I think the state of Texas has really been able to retain the high school model, and it's a powerful high school model across many sports. But I do think that some of this, it has to do with high school associations just setting some policies around and guardrails around the club experience for high school athletes. Some examples of that are, the number of games that you're allowed to play outside of your high school team. There is a way, and I say this because I do believe that this is not mutually exclusive. There's a way for clubs and high school programs to coexist. We just have to work. And I think the parents need to be engaged in that process. And I think what you're probably going to find is, because right now we're left with the haves and the have-nots. If you can afford $6,000 a summer to have your daughter play volleyball, many people don't, right? And all the recruiters are going to see the clubs. But if you can't afford it, then you don't. I think that parents have to insist that there is some legislation or guardrails that are put around clubs versus high school and how they can play together.
Awesome. And we just have to get ending right now. So thank you both so much for taking part in this conversation. We really appreciate you both getting on and really talking about some tough subjects.
Thank you so much for having me. You guys, good luck to everybody. Everybody better have a 6-pack by spring. Bye.
Thank you.